On February 19, 2026, NASA declared Starliner's crew flight test a Type A mishap and said the deeper problem went beyond hardware. The visible trigger was a propulsion anomaly during rendezvous, but NASA's own findings pointed to something more serious: qualification gaps, leadership missteps, and cultural breakdowns inside the program itself. That distinction matters. This is not mainly a story about thrusters. It is a story about what happens when a human spaceflight program carries technical ambiguity into flight and the institution around it is not fully aligned on how risk should be governed once a major anomaly occurs. Starliner launched on June 5, 2024, for what was originally planned as an 8 to 14-day crewed test flight to the International Space Station. Instead, the mission stretched to 93 days. That extension is not just a scheduling detail. It changes what the mission means institutionally. A short-duration crewed demonstration became a prolonged risk management problem, with NASA forced to decide not only what Starliner had done, but what level of uncertainty was still acceptable once the spacecraft had already reached orbit. After reviewing flight data and conducting ground tests, NASA decided to return the spacecraft without its astronauts. The mission outcome changed in an important way. Confidence in Starliner's safety for crew return was no longer high enough. That does not mean the mission failed in the broadest possible sense. It means the mission no longer validated what it had originally been intended to validate. A crewed flight test that ends with an uncrewed return tells you something important about where institutional confidence broke down. The event that gave the later investigation its weight came during rendezvous. According to the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, multiple in-flight propulsion anomalies occurred, including the loss of 5 thrusters and a temporary loss of control as Starliner approached the station. On-orbit troubleshooting recovered enough capability to complete docking, but ASAP said the event briefly raised the possibility of loss of vehicle and crew if control could not be restored. That is why the propulsion issue matters. Not because it is a dramatic spacecraft malfunction, but because it forced the program into an immediate governance test. Once control was lost, even temporarily, these central questions were no longer purely mechanical. They became institutional. Who owned the risk? Which objective now governed the mission? And how clearly NASA could define authority, priorities, and acceptable safety margins after the anomaly. NASA's program investigation team was formed to examine exactly that broader picture. When NASA released the findings in February 2026, it said investigators had identified an interplay of combined hardware failures, qualification gaps, leadership missteps, and cultural breakdowns that created risk conditions inconsistent with NASA's human spaceflight safety standards. NASA also said that beyond technical issues, broader programmatic objectives had influenced engineering and operational decisions during and after the mission. That combination, hardware ambiguity and institutional misalignment, is what makes these findings matter beyond the propulsion anomaly itself. Technical root cause work, however, was still going on at the time of release. That language is the center of the story. NASA did not describe Starliner as a spacecraft problem alone. It described a program in which technical uncertainty was managed within an institution whose decision structures did not operate with sufficient clarity when the mission moved outside its expected envelope. The thruster anomalies were the visible symptom. The more consequential finding was how risk was understood, communicated, and governed around them. The Type A mishap classification matters for the same reason. NASA said the designation reflected the potential for a significant mishap after Starliner temporarily lost maneuverability during rendezvous. In other words, the agency was not simply acknowledging a technical issue, it was formally recognizing that the event had major safety significance. But the timing of that recognition is one of the most important institutional questions in the entire story. ASAP drew a sharper distinction. The panel said NASA did not formally declare an in-flight mishap or high-visibility close call during the mission, despite guidance to do so. ASAP wrote that this failure created confusion regarding decision-making authority, priorities, and risk ownership during an extended period of operations. That is a crucial difference. NASA's formal Type A mishap declaration came later in February 2026. ASAP's criticism is that the seriousness of the event was not formally declared in real time, when that declaration could have clarified who was responsible for what while the crew was still in orbit. In a crewed mission operating under anomaly conditions, that kind of clarity is not a procedural preference, it is a functional requirement. That timeline matters because mishap declarations are not only retrospective labels. In a crewed mission, they also serve as management tools. A timely declaration can sharpen authority, establish the primary objective, and reduce ambiguity about what safety standard now governs the response. According to ASAP, that did not happen clearly enough here. ASAP pushed the point further. After the loss of control event and eventual docking, the panel said there was uncertainty about which of the two postures should govern the mission. One posture assumed Starliner could still be proven safe for crewed return. The other assumed the vehicle should be treated as a no-go for crewed return unless the failures could be shown not to recur. ASAP argued that this dissonance persisted for months. Put simply, risk ownership and decision logic remained ambiguous for too long. That ambiguity did not resolve itself. It was only resolved when NASA ultimately decided to return Starliner uncrewed. That is why this investigation matters beyond Starliner itself. And if you value analysis of how human spaceflight risk is actually governed, subscribe to SpaceWatch, because the most important part of this story begins after the anomaly, not before it. NASA and Boeing are still working on corrective actions, but the institutional question is already visible. Can a commercial crew oversight model preserve strategic program goals without blurring who controls safety decisions once a mission enters crisis conditions? That question matters beyond one spacecraft because Starliner is not just a Boeing problem. It is also a test of how NASA governs commercial crew under stress. A program designed to preserve redundancy and strategic resilience still depends on clear authority, a sharp risk posture, and a decision structure that does not drift once anomalies disrupt the mission plan. If those conditions are not maintained, then the problem is no longer only spacecraft performance. It is whether the oversight model itself becomes less reliable when pressure rises. And that is a question that applies to every future crewed mission NASA manages through a commercial partner. NASA says Starliner will return to flight only when ready. That is an important line, but it does not close the deeper issue. Corrective actions can improve hardware, processes, and testing. The harder institutional test is whether NASA can show that the next time a major anomaly collides with programmatic pressure, its decision structure will behave differently. The central issue is still NASA's own decision structure. So the real test now is not only whether Boeing can fix a propulsion system, it is whether NASA can show that its human spaceflight system will make a different decision the next time a major anomaly forces the agency to choose between preserving program momentum and clarifying ownership of safety risk. Starliner exposed more than a technical weakness. It exposed a governance question, and until NASA can answer that question convincingly, the mission's most important lesson will remain institutional, not mechanical. When programmatic pressure and safety risk collide again, will NASA's decision structure behave differently?